When I first got a mic, one of the very first videos I made using it was a ranking of most of the stages in SRB2. As with all of my old videos, it was terrible. I had only played through SRB2 completely once or twice, and not even with every vanilla character. And I hadn't even unlocked all of the bonus levels, so I only covered those found in the main campaign. It was an incomplete list, and even a few days after releasing the video, I felt most of my placements were nonsense. I've thought about remaking that video a lot since then, but I've always had something else to distract me. That is, until now. I've got a new PC coming soon and I want to avoid recording anything new on my current one until it arrives. Seeing as that means no new mod reviews or playthrough episodes for the time being, it seems like now is the perfect time to finally get around to doing this. But before I begin, a few ground rules and some criteria. I'm only going to be talking about the vanilla set of platforming levels, so no modded levels are going to be mentioned here. But on top of that, I'm not going to mention any special stages, because they play so differently to the base set of levels that they're basically impossible to compare. That also goes for Dream Hill and the other unlockable night mode stages as well, for the same reason. I'm going to discuss each act of a zone as a separate level, but with one debatable exception, I won't talk about any boss stages, because there's almost no level to speak of with most of them. If you want to see me rank the bosses, I've linked the video where I do just that in the description. I'm not basing this off of a playthrough as any one character in particular, and there's not any real methodology to how I've ordered these. I've just listed the stages based on how much I enjoy them, whether that's because of level design, aesthetics, music, or any other reason. Finally, while I've thought about this from a vanilla standpoint, a lot of the footage will be of modded characters because in a lot of cases, they just happen to be the character I was using when I recorded footage of that stage. But with that in mind, picking the worst stage in SRB2 was very easy. No one likes Azure Temple. Reading through the scant mentions of it from official channels, I don't even think the devs like Azure Temple. As the final challenge stage of the game, you'd obviously expect a slight difficulty spike even compared to Haunted Heights and Aerial Garden, but this is too much. A level taking place entirely underwater, with checkpoints and air bubbles few and far between, where you have to face easily the hardest platforming in the game at the same time as rows of statues turn half of the rooms of this labyrinth into a 3D bullet hell, was never going to be a good time, but maybe it would be manageable if extreme care was put into balancing it delicately. Sonic Team Jr., seemingly intentionally, didn't bother doing that, and therefore it's just as overwhelming as it sounds. You'll note that all of my footage of Azure Temple is from my Echoes review, and that's because it is the only time in all of my years playing SRB2 that I have actually completed the stage. Just atrocious. I think this level so rarely that it might as well not even be in the game, and seeing how the only time I ever see Azure Temple mentioned is during discussions about how miserable it is, I think the same goes for everyone else. But with that absolute flop of an ending out of the way, the quality tightens up so much that choosing second worst gets really tough. In the end though, I think that honour needs to go to Aerial Garden. The jumping quality between this and Azure Temple cannot be overstated. And Aerial Garden is a fun stage as Tails, Knuckles and a lot of modded characters, basically anyone with any verticality, but it isn't great as characters like Sonic or Amy. The beginning and ending portions are alright, but the middle is a repetitive series of tiny platforms you need to jump between to reach a corridor that leads to another open space to do the same thing all over again. On top of that, you're constantly accosted by the spawn of the hive elementals all over the stage, which as a duo are probably the most annoying badniks in the game. If you can fly or glide or climb to avoid them, they're not too bad, but if the ground is actually something you need to consider, they swarm so quickly that they can become a nightmare. Visually, it's a bit of a mess, but the music makes up for that, so its low ranking is entirely based on how much it relies on you playing as specific characters to be enjoyable. In the end though, of all of the challenge stages, this is the one that I'll return to the most, even if I think that the first one you unlock is the objective best. Egg Rock Act 1 is going to take 19th place as the worst stage in the campaign. I don't think it's necessarily a hot take to say that SRB2 loses steam towards the end, whether that's lackluster bosses or, in this case, worse stages. I think Egg Rock Act 1 is the worst it gets though. The music and visuals are pretty good, although they're equal to or outclassed by Act 2, and it feels really short, but it makes up for that by packing in some nasty sections. Taking the obvious path alternates you between sections that are slow, painful, or even sometimes a mixture of both, but taking the hidden right path is misery the entire way. This laser corridor is possibly the biggest pace killer in the game, even if it is entirely predictable, and I've never gotten the hang of this crusher section. The disappearing staircase on the other path is the absolute worst section in the campaign though, so I always go for the easy path so that I can at least chill out in the few sections that are just a bit boring. Egg Rock Act 2 has its own share of awkward platforming and is still far from the best SRB2 can offer, but it is miles better than its predecessor. I don't know whether this is a hot take, but Hype Towers has never really gripped me. That's probably because I've never been a big Mario fan. I'm a Sonic guy through and through, but it's always felt a bit stop-start. You're constantly dropping down pipes just to immediately climb back up high enough to do it all over again, and you never get to build up a sense of speed or flow because of that. Springs and mushrooms are repeated over and over as Sonic stages always do with their gimmicks, but they're never used in a way that's particularly interesting. It also feels a lot shorter and more linear than the other bonus stages, which stops it from playing to the strengths of most of SRB2's other levels. With that said, it does capture the Mario vibe well, even down to I got a copyright strike on an old video wherein I had gameplay of it without commentary over the music, and this is definitely the point where the stages go from mediocre to just plain good. It's already gone really hard to pick out the inferior levels, but I'm going to give 17th place to the most recent addition to the roster, Final Demo Zone. As a means of honouring SRB2's past, it does a much better job than Techno Legacy, the level it replaced, as it includes a much larger portion of the game as it existed in the final demo days. But when comparing it to the zones as they exist now, it doesn't come out favourably. Final Demo just didn't have the complexity of level design or as high a standard of sprites and music as the modern incarnation of SRB2. So while this is a neat trip down memory lane, nostalgia can only carry it so far into the ranking. It does what it attempts to do perfectly, and is a great reward for collecting 100 emblems. But in the end, it had to go somewhere, and this is just where it ended up. Black Core Act 1 is the potential exception to the no boss rule I mentioned earlier, as I don't know whether the Metal Sonic race is considered to be a boss, but I feel it had to be included somehow. A final gauntlet of platforming challenges, this can be a real struggle on your first playthrough, but once you've gone to grips with the game and have found some of the shortcuts and skips available to you, it gets a lot easier. Metal Sonic is basically a physical time limit, giving you about a minute and a half to complete the course, which ranges from incredibly generous to a fair challenge, depending on the character you play as. The course itself isn't too difficult. In fact, I'd argue Egg Rock is harder overall, but despite being almost completely linear, you get a lot of room to cut some time out of your run, and I like how Metal Sonic's path of destruction can actually help you by breaking some obstacles if you end up falling behind. It's a fine course for your race to take place on, but it is basic, so it can only get so far. And now, Egg Rock can claim the dubious honour of being eliminated before most other zones have even appeared, because while Act 2 is better than Act 1 in most ways, it's still not as fun as the rest of the campaign. There's only one area I'd say is as annoying as the first act, which is this section with the disappearing blocks, and I'd actually choose to play on this level when I want to test how well a character plays at low speeds. But for as fun as the platforming often is, it just can't match the thrill of blazing through a level at lightning speeds. There are definitely a few moments where you're given some space to build up some momentum, but there's also a lot of waiting for a generator to boot up, or for an elevator to get to the right place, or for a teleporter to charge up alongside that. If SRB2 was an official release, Eggman Act 2 would honestly probably be the best final stage in the classic series, but I think an earlier stage better fuses the tricky platforming and speed opportunities together. At this point, I don't think any of the remaining stages have any serious flaws. The next few are all of pretty equivalent quality, and the order I put them in today isn't necessarily the order I put them in tomorrow. For today, Deep Sea Act 1 is getting the short end of the stick. There's nothing wrong with it, but it's just so short. Even quite casually, it's no struggle at all to beat the level in around a minute. And outside of the crustaceans, there's not really any challenges that should give you any trouble. The previous two zones are similarly easy, but seeing as we're definitely past the introduction at this point, there should have been a more pronounced jump in difficulty. If there was one, maybe there'd be fewer complaints from new players about Castle Eggman being such a difficulty spike. Greenflower is a great introduction to SRB2, which is why it's made it this far into the video, but as a veteran player, it's the later courses that I'm excited to get into when I start a new playthrough. Of the two acts, I'm putting Act 2 lower, only because I don't think it's quite as iconic as Act 1. I honestly prefer most of it, such as the music, visuals, and a lot of the level design, and I think it does a great job of increasing the number of paths available to the player. It only places lower because it isn't your first impression of the game, but if I really had to assign it some flaws, I guess I could say it doesn't do a great job of introducing character-specific paths. They're certainly there, but you have to go pretty far out of your way off the main path to reach them. I'm really grasping at straws though, because I'd argue that's a pretty justifiable design choice considering you'd likely only look for them in later playthroughs. Greenflower Act 1's icon status is only going to give it an extra rung up on the ladder. It's a great introduction to the game, subtly urging you to learn the basics of jumping, rolling, and whatever abilities your chosen character has, as well as introducing water mechanics, bandits, seals, and even emblems and special stages due to a few really obvious collectibles. As the first taste you're ever going to get of the game, and effectively a second tutorial, it does exactly what it needs to. But again, I'm not viewing these stages from the perspective of a new player, and it's the later levels that I'm actually excited to play. Forest Fortress has a sort of mystic property to me, as it's a stage that I didn't get to play for the longest time. I never bothered collecting the emblems, so it wasn't until I booted up the game one day and found out a mod I downloaded must have included a 100% save that I actually got to experience it. It's a cool look at what Sonic Team Jr. were considering for the redevelopment of Castle Eggman, and I love the aesthetic, especially the constant rain. The only problem is that it can be a bit of a maze, but I'm willing to accept that might be an experience on my end. A lot of SRB2 levels can be pretty confusing when you first play them, and I just don't have the hours logged on this one that I do on the campaign and other bonus stages. Arid Canyon is a zone that's never really clicked with me. Much like Greenflower, I consider both acts to be equal to one another, but for this ranking, I'm going to say Act 1 is inferior. The final rope section is not great if you don't have some way to avoid it, and for as many distinct and interesting alternate paths as there are here, they do all unfortunately converge on what is bound to be a pace breaker. With that said, aesthetics are on point, and I think the opening section is amazing with the sheer number of paths and ways to reach them it offers in the first 30 seconds. It also has a lot more sections taking place on the road, where you can really just build up a ton of speed, which Act 2 mostly lacks. So while I've placed it lower on the ranking today, they really are neck and neck for me. And so it soon comes as a surprise that Arid Canyon Act 2 takes 9th place on today's list. It has fewer paths available to you compared to Act 1, but I'd argue it makes up for that by having each path be more unique and, in my eyes at least, more fun. They all once again collide towards the end for a final sequence, but this one is a minecart section, which I enjoy more. You need to be a bit more aware of what's going on compared to the ropes, and there are some crazy jumps here that allow you to speed it up, even if I'm not brave enough to attempt them. I think the Looney Tunes aesthetic is even better here than before, and some of the sections involving the bass are as close to impressive set pieces as SRB2 ever gets. But now, we're getting to the levels that I really love, the ones that I look forward to more than any other when I begin a run. Alright, I've got to admit that Frozen Hillside made it this high in the rankings purely because of the music. It's one of my favourite tracks in the game, no doubt about it. And while it was somewhat carried by the music, the level itself isn't bad either. A bit short and a bit linear maybe, but you can build up a good sense of speed if you properly plan your route through the level beforehand. It also gets points for likely being the first bonus stage you'll unlock, as it only requires 5 emblems, and for giving you Amy Rose upon completion. Aesthetics, music, and its likely role in most players' time in SRB2 come together to make a really good stage. But I admit the level design isn't all that, which is why it's only getting the 8th place spot. Techno Hill Act 2 is a really fun stage, and I'd say it's the point where the game fully opens up. You're given 3 different paths to follow almost immediately, with a ton of secrets and collectibles along them that are only reachable via the use of your character abilities, giving it replay value that I feel Greenflower didn't quite have in the same way. This might also be my favourite track in the game, and paired with the level aesthetics in the skybox, it feels like you've entered the heart of Eggman's operations in a way that is never matched again, even when you're exploring the space stations and castles that literally share his name. It only ranks below Act 1 because there's just a little too much waiting around in a few areas, such as when you need to drop into chemicals or wait for elevators to arrive. Nothing that ruins the level, but at this point it's these tiny details that need to be considered to differentiate it from the remaining acts. This is yet another situation where I found it really difficult to decide whether the first or second act of a zone is superior, but I'm going to say that for Castle Eggman, Act 2 comes out on top. Obviously, considering that it's this high in the rankings, that doesn't mean that Act 1 is a bad level, but I feel it's missing that little something that would allow it to beat Act 2. I just find myself less interested in exploring alternate paths here, but that's not to say they're bad. In fact, almost all of them are great. The sunset and castle exterior are themes rarely seen in Sonic games, and I love all of the Bannics here. They feel so well attuned to the European castle aesthetic, while their counterparts in other zones are often a bit more nondescript. There is a big difficulty spike here, but I think it was necessary by this point in the adventure, and the level never feels unfair despite that. The collapsing bridge is also possibly the best final section in the game, especially now that the build-up to it has been given a new suspenseful track in the latest update. A great stage all around. We've gone to the top 5 now, and I've got to give this one to Haunted Heights. Making this video helped me realise how quickly the challenge stages in SRB2 fall off a cliff, because while Aerial Garden and Azrael Temple make up the bottom of the list, I think Haunted Heights is a perfect example of upping the difficulty from the campaign without overdoing it. The Bannics are a lot more dangerous than those in the campaign, the gimmicks are often used in unique and interesting ways, and the window of error is smaller across most of the challenges you'll encounter, but it isn't instant death if you do make a mistake. I especially like the moment where you need to make your way up a tower to get the height needed to drop through some chemicals, as well as the sticky webs found throughout the level. Although I do think the disappearing floor sections are annoying. At least there is the small mercy of how they just drop you at the start of the area if you mess up, rather than outright kill you. I think this might be the strongest stage aesthetically, and the music is once again fantastic. Before I move on though, is the Jack-o'-lantern the only Doom reference in the game? If so, Sonic Team Jr. has been a lot more restrained than I would be. Techno Hill Act 1 is easily the best example of environmental storytelling in SRB2. A polluted region near Greenflower Mountain, it uses recolored texture from Greenflower Zone to place it nearby in the world. Smart asset reuse, and I wish more zones did something like this, as most feel entirely disconnected from those before and after it. As for the level itself, I couldn't really tell you why I enjoy it more than Act 2, but waiting around for these presser jets to launch you has always annoyed me less than getting stuck in the chemical ooze, or waiting for an elevator. I suppose I like the Knuckles path here more than in Act 2. The enemies are used in a more interesting manner, I guess, and I think the main path is stronger, even if there's less variety in the alternate routes. Honestly, Techno Hill is a really strong zone, and its acts could swap around and I'd still be happy. I'd say it's the second best zone in the game. Red Volcano should be able to claim the second best title, but I can't give it that in good faith while we wait forevermore for it to get a second act. But what a jump! In my original zone ranking, I placed Red Volcano dead last, claiming it to be poorly balanced and a complete slog. Definition of a skill issue. As the penultimate zone in the game, because Black Core is a 3-part Act 3 for Egg Rock if we're being real, it balances tough platforming and speed really well. If you time it right and keep up your flow, you never really need to slow down to account for obstacles in the same way you need to in Egg Rock. They're still very much a real threat, but as I've built up my confidence playing this game over time, I know that if I can stay on the top path, I'll get my moments of speed as a reward for my practice, which is ultimately the cornerstone of the entire Sonic franchise. Maybe it is a bit linear, but I think that works to the level's benefit. I was toying with giving Red Volcano first place and really flipping the old ranking on its head, but I have to admit that if you do end up knocked off the optimal path for whatever reason, the lower path can often be a bit of a slog. In the end, there were 2 levels I think are basically perfect, and so Red Volcano could only be given a very respectable third. It's been a while since Deep Sea has gone immense, hasn't it? In another instance, the tables turning, I gave Deep Sea as a whole 6th place in the old ranking, and I didn't think it was going to do amazingly here. But as I mulled over the level roster and compared them to one another, I came to the realization that I really love Deep Sea Act 2. Other than Hydrosity, I don't think many Sonic water stages can claim to be particularly quick, but Act 2 absolutely is. Between the water slides and the wide, open spaces, you can go really fast here, but the level is long enough that it doesn't feel like it finishes as soon as it's beginning to build up steam. I'd say there are 2 main paths to the level, but unlike the other levels in the game, it feels like as soon as they branch apart at the beginning of the stage, they don't truly come together again until right at the very end. I find myself falling into a trance state when I play this, building up such a strong sense of flow. It's amazing. You know how Sonic Mania tends to play it safe with its first act of each zone, before blowing you away with a far more exciting and interesting Act 2? Well, I think SRB2 does that as well, but nowhere do I think that's quite as strong as here in Deep Sea. This and my first place pick are S-rank stages, no doubt about it. Castle Eggman Act 2 is a perfect example of all of the highlights of SRB2's level design. We have space to build up a sense of speed and flow. We have a bunch of well-hidden but not frustratingly obtuse collectibles. We have more branching paths, secret areas, shortcuts and skips than you can take a stick at. Pair that with the perfect level of difficulty, verticality, complexity, interconnectedness and so forth, as well as the best rotor mechanics in the campaign, which have been used to excellent effect, and, well, I'd say it was an easy choice for first place, but the level of quality the upper tier of SRB2 stages exhibit means that wouldn't be entirely truthful. The point is, it always feels like I'm learning about a new area you can reach, and it's one of the highlights of every new playthrough I have. I'd say Deep Sea Act 2 has a better sense of speed, and Red Volcano has more involved and interesting platforming, but Castle Eggman Act 2 is unrivaled when it comes to exploration and variety, and I've come to realise that's what I think SRB2 does best. Flawless stage. And there are my thoughts on all 21 of the single player, not a boss arena stages in SRB2. I understand that I mentioned a few times that I thought stages could shuffle around a lot depending on my mood on any given day, so if you want a handy visual to remember this ranking, here they are, arranged in a handy tier list. Azure Temple sitting lonely in E tier, as it deserves, and Red Volcano, Deep Sea Act 2, and Castle Eggman Act 2 all in S tier. If you want to rank all of these yourself, I've left a link to the tier list in the description. But what did you think of my ranking? Were there any stages you thought I was too harsh on, or that I think way too highly of? I'm not well versed in the SRB2 community groupthink, so for all I know, I've committed a faux pas by claiming Arid Canyon to be kinda mid. Feel free to argue in the comments below. All opinions are welcome, but I will delete your comment if you try and justify Azure Temple. Don't even think about it. I hope you enjoyed the video, and ciao.